So thank you, John. Welcome, everybody. As John said, I'm Tom Wheeler. I am the warm-up act for the real act that you came to see. Let me just dive right in. The discussion today is about digital platform regulation. So let's start with a question of what is a digital platform? The reality is that upon an open internet, a handful of companies built a superstructure that closed down that openness and created their opportunities called platform companies. And we just listed a few of the characteristics of platform companies here, that they're multi-sided. What does that mean? A multi-sided market is where you offer a product or service over here on this side of the market, and the fact that you're offering it gives you something to offer to this side of the market. The classic example is newspapers. One side of the market is getting you as a subscriber. The other side of the market is selling your eyeballs to advertisers. And that's the kind of business structure that the platforms are engaged in. And while that may be a old, long-standing corporate structure, marketplace structure, the realities of the internet change it substantially to increase the power of those platforms. Obviously, there are scope and scale economies, but you add to that network effects, the fact that there is an increase in the utility of a service, the more individuals sign on, and you end up with a situation where, in the newspaper example, for instance, the development of the market, you have scope and scale economies, and the market goes like this and begins to level off, because at some point in time, you can only take those scope and scale economies so far before they become burdensome, inhibit innovation, create bureaucratic problems, etc. Add those scope and scales to network effects and the capabilities of the internet, however, and you get a growth curve that goes like this. And whereas the first one encouraged or resulted in multiple players being able to offer a service, the internet growth curve ends up being pretty much a winner-take-all reality. And that leads to the question, well, that as this says, that's often vertically integrated. And that leads to the question that, okay, those companies then end up with substantial market power. And what do you do about that market power? Well, the discussion today is about how Europe is leading the way in dealing with that market power. And the question is why? You know, the post-World War II economic order has been challenged, especially by China. And not only the economic order, but online governance. And Europe, caught between wanting to do business with both the United States and China, says, okay, how do we exist and how do we make our own rules that don't have others establishing the rules for us, the second largest contiguous market in the world? And so while the United States leads in technology development, the policymakers in Europe have said, we'll lead in policy development. We'll lead in regulatory development. And They are encouraged to do that because they're operating a consumer economy versus the United States and China in more creator economy, because of the reduced political power of the dominant platforms, and because Europe exhausted their reliance on antitrust as the sole solution faster than we did. So then let's talk about some of those specifics. The reality is that the depth of thought, the analysis, and the debate that has gone into these issues in the EU far outstrips what's happened in the United States, especially in the United States Congress. As I said a minute ago, antitrust, they tried it. Now what? I think there was a recognition that antitrust is important, but it's not the one-trick pony that is going to deal with the kind of platform problems that we have been talking about a minute ago. They also had a different political environment. Obviously, it was us, the EU, against the world. It's an us versus them situation. There are those in this country who argue, who worry that under the guise of consumer protection, it really is trade protection. And yet, despite the similarities between the democratic processes in the US and the EU, we have both reached different kinds of conclusions. Where in the United States, everything focuses on the discussion of the benefits of the what the platforms deliver, the impact on innovation and investment, and if you regulate it, you're going to break this magic. Whereas in Europe, there is more of a focus on what is the effect of the technology. And when the platform companies went to Brussels and argued the same way they argue in Washington, which is basically, this is going to hurt innovation, this is going to hurt investment, it was an argument that didn't sell. And one of the reasons why that argument sells in this country and didn't sell over there is because of economic power leading to political power. I want to show you a couple of quick examples that the platform companies have been running in television advertisements against some very basic reforms in Congress of the antitrust laws. The question is, how do I get her to play? Oops, there's the next one. Okay, what's the secret of getting her to play? There we go.
Technology touches every corner of our economy. When things shut down and folks turned to the internet, American technology was my small business's lifeline, keeping me connected to my clients. But some politicians are pushing new laws that will weaken American technology. Their misguided agenda will make small businesses dependent on China for the technology we use every day. I have a message for Congress. Don't weaken American technology.
Okay, so there's one example. There's another one here somewhere hiding. Okay. So I'd like to talk to you about technology.
There you go. You got it.
Never go on stage.
Russia's war on democracy includes cyber warfare against the U.S. Americans have been urged to lock their digital doors. So why is Congress considering tech legislation that makes us less safe? Former military, CIA, and national security officials believe these bills will damage technology's ability to safeguard users from nefarious apps and malicious actors. Tell Congress to listen to the security experts. Don't break American technology when we need it most. Paid for by CTA and its members.
Okay, and then last and definitely not least,
With broken supply chains and lives disrupted, businesses like Amazon have invested to deliver on time for you and help hundreds of thousands of small businesses gain access to millions of online shoppers. But Washington politicians have a law that could break Prime's guaranteed 2-day free delivery and threaten our fragile economic recovery. Tell your senators, don't break our Prime. Oppose S 2992. Paid for by CCIA.
okay, now we all, I had the same, I laughed and then I was outraged. But look at this. Small business, national security, don't take our free stuff away. Did you ever see the word competition or antitrust or anything like this? No. This is what has kept these minimal, important, but minimal antitrust reforms bottled up and not getting a vote in the United States Senate. And we should not be surprised because we have seen this picture before, and I'm trying to bring up a quote anyway. Okay, this, I will read it to you, but you don't have to. Oh, good. When the Industrial Revolution was in its early stages, the railroads were playing a similar kind of role as the platforms. This is what the newspaper in Des Moines, Iowa wrote about how the railroads were taking their monopoly profits and turning them around to run PR campaigns to stop the regulation that might have an impact on their monopoly profits. So this is 100-year-old, or if you actually look at this, 150-year-old reality that we are once again facing today in this country. What's different is that we're living in an interconnected world in which the decisions that get made in a group of nations like the EU have an effect around the world. And that's the cue for Gene Kimmelman.
I'm not Tom.
Oh,
Good morning, everyone. So it's always hard to follow Tom, but I want to kind of dig back from his macro points, take you back to Europe a little bit, as we kind of going to look at some of the details of the DMA. And I want to tell you that the deck that we'll be running is very comprehensive, and it's the great work of our two great RAs, Sadiv and Jordi. Thank you for doing this, helping pull this together. I am not going to go through all the details. There's a lot here. You should think of it as a resource for the future. But when Tom started and told you a little bit about what was going on in Europe with looking at platforms, he highlighted their characteristics, but there's a critical thing to think about in conjunction with that, as the Europeans were thinking of all these various political forces. And when you have these network effects on huge network systems where there's scale and scope economies, you also had major antitrust cases brought by the Europeans. While the Americans did not, thought about, but did not bring them 10 plus years ago, Google Shopping and a challenge on Google's Android suite of services, both successful litigation against a dominant company that Tom said the Europeans weren't satisfied with. And it goes back to those characteristics of the platforms and also some attributes of antitrust law in Europe, where they did not seek to break the company up and possibly could not have. It's unclear exactly under European law, but they set penalties and a set of behavioral changes. And it didn't work very well. And there was an ongoing discussion after that about how do you adjust these remedies, and are we doing the right thing? Can you deal with it? So think about it. When you've got an almost winner-take-all environment where a company on a platform, whether it's a marketplace or Google with all of its tremendous search capability, is gathering data at scales that we've never imagined before and applying AI, machine learning to it, and developing these tremendous capabilities with everyone riding on their platform and no one else doing what they're doing. How do you get competition? You can bring an antitrust case and you can talk about various remedies, but the Europeans started thinking about this a little differently a few years ago and decided that what they really needed to do was add on to antitrust, not drop it, because they've run cases against Apple and Facebook and more against Google, and Amazon is now in the picture too. So antitrust continues. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what do you do? It was very simple in a way. There are some big companies out there that are running these platforms, but not everything they do is automatically bad or automatically good. You have to differentiate what is it that is making it difficult for anyone else to enter and grow in these markets and take them on, as we've seen so many times before with every other previous technological advancement. Dominant firms have been brought to their heels at some point. What does it take? So target big companies and look for what are key services they offer. So the key points that they focused on as they're developing the DMA, which is about to now spring into effect, and we'll go through the elements of that a little bit more in detail, is number one, add on to antitrust, make something complementary. Do what antitrust doesn't do, which is set generic rules across a sector rather than looking at specific behaviors of one particular company, because there's so much of this happening across various platform markets. Designate some companies, calling them gatekeepers. Think about how this could change over time, and you might need rules that can be adjusted as you go. And then think about what are the things they offer that everyone really relies upon and depends upon. And then once you pull all that together, come up with some really hard-hitting remedies so that you don't have the problem that you face with your antitrust cases. Now, how in the world, thinking of Europe with its diverse cultures, do you even take those ideas and come together cohesively with one law? Well, when you have a cacophony of ongoing complaints about unfair practices, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple. So just think about it. Mark Zuckerberg goes out and buys Instagram, buys WhatsApp, and subsumes them within. Were those going to be competitors? Then along comes a little app, Vine, and you can see documents showing that when little Vine is running along the Facebook platform, like so many other service providers, is gaining some traction. Mark Zuckerberg says, cut off the APIs, take them out. See things like that happening over and over in the Meta ecosystem. And then you go to Google, everything that's already been cases in Europe, but just keep going on. Yelp has these great reviews of all these things that people love to know about what their friends say about restaurants, what people who've been in a community say, and they can't get elevated in Google search. Why is that? Hotels, same experience. Travel services across the board, same experience. Even with in the Android ecosystem with free Android, well, it isn't totally free. What you find is you have to buy the entire suite of Google services if you want to take advantage of this lovely dominant operating system, the only alternative to Apple. So then you hear all the complaints about Amazon. All these companies are selling on Amazon. But Amazon starts doing its own white label products. You get Amazon batteries, you can get all the food from Whole Foods, you can get all these things. And the sellers are all saying, wait a minute, they're taking my data, my information about my customers, everything I know about marketing to them, everything I learn about how to make my next dollar, and they're using it against me. How's that fair? And then the world of the App Store. Apple, also Google, but Apple probably getting most of the attention. You have everyone from Epic, other app developers saying, I want to get my apps in, but everything is controlled by Apple. Not just controlled by Apple. They run it. They basically hoard all the data. So you have complaints coming right in. Epic wants to use its own payment service. Nope, Apple Pay. That's it. You want in, Apple Pay, that's it. Over and over and over again. So this is what really starts driving the process going forward. And so Europe says enough is enough. And the countries come together in a faster time frame than almost any piece of legislation, certainly I've seen in Europe. And the DMA is passed, now taking effect this month. So what happens next? Here's my prediction. Here we are with Meta. Let's look at them. This law is amazing. Specific prohibitions on certain practices, specific behavioral requirements, prohibitions on certain kinds of contracts, just going down the list. Facebook has to open itself up to its competitors and interoperate. The same way you can send anyone an email, right, using any service you want. The same way you can make phone calls across networks using different companies. You'd be able to reach everyone in the Facebook ecosystem from Snap, from TikTok, from whatever, without having to give your data to Facebook, without having to actually use their tools, their other services, letting them see everything about you. No, 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 you are a TikTok customer. You get to talk to everybody in the Facebook world. Pretty big change, right? You can take your own data, you can port it. New acquisitions, the next Instagram, the next, no, you got to report it all to the European Commission, regardless of how small or big it is, so they can look at it carefully, not just under antitrust, but whether there's something in the DMA they want to take on. Advertisers get to have greater control and awareness of the placements, what's working, what's not. It's not all what Facebook offers to you, it's what you have a right to. And they can't combine personal data across services. Not too bad, huh? Let's look at Google. Here's what's supposed to happen with Google. No more search preferencing. Access to all their query data. If you're Yelp, if you're Kayak, if you're anyone riding their platform, you get access to all of it. They can't combine it. They can't preference it through indexing and through rankings. All of those contracts Google has, that's basically default placement, or if you want to use Google search, you really need to be in our entire advertising ecosystem. All of that's split apart. You can pick whoever you want if you're a business riding on their platform, and any user can get their service from anyone who uses Google's platform, not just combined Google services. Split it all apart. Publishers didn't like Google very much for quite a while. They were losing a lot of revenue. and saying they weren't getting any information on their ad placements or even just their success rates or where all the money was going because it wasn't going into their pockets. All that made transparent, all of that opened up through the DMA. So let's look at Amazon. Those sellers, Amazon is not allowed to use the data from their sellers. Amazon is not allowed to combine data from their services with anyone else's data. Businesses who want to sell on Amazon's marketplace, but also want to go to Walmart or Target or anywhere else, can sell at a lower price or a different set of services or any other combination of commercial practices that is more favorable than on Amazon. Amazon can't prevent them from doing that and can't knock them off of their platform. So then Apple. We're going to open up the App Store. You get to sideload your apps. You get to use whatever payment system you want. Again, Apple can't control all the data. You get to install what you want. You get to uninstall what you want at no cost, all by mandate. And can this really happen? What I've just described? That's astounding. I mean, it's a sea change in how every one of these dominant platforms would have to work. So let's look at these prohibitions and obligations. I mean, this list is amazing. I'll give you a second to look at this. This is remarkable. So think about it. In most cases, we pass laws and we say we're going to stop unfair and deceptive practices, or we're going to say you have to serve the public interest. And then we turn it over to people like Tom Wheeler to figure out, like, how do you interpret that? And how do you balance all the equities? It's not what Europe did. These are specific obligations and prohibitions against these companies. And there's some more. There's some of the cloud services. There's messaging. I'm just picking some of the highlights here. But look at this. All kinds of data practices opened up. Something none of the companies have been willing to do. If you go down to interoperability, this is really, again, earth-shattering for their operations. This would pretty much, if it works, allow all kinds of small players to get on platforms and take advantage of the scale and scope economies of those platforms to try to build their own business. Ride the platform to compete against the platform. It's remarkable. And then on the tying side, this is what frees up businesses ultimately, but think of it from a user perspective. You get to pick and choose everything you want. You don't have to buy this suite of Google services. You don't have to give them all your data. Same for Apple and across. You get to be your own master of mixing and matching what you're doing on the platform. And that opens the door to millions of other businesses that can come and serve you on that platform, even though they don't own it. So I think this is like a huge change in business practices in Europe, if it works. But it's also not alone. Remember, we said this was on top of antitrust. So what has happened here is the European Commission will kind of divide up its functions with some overlap. Some cases will go forward case by case. Some of these rules will start kicking into effect. And then they'll have the big job of how to mix and match correctly or efficiently, right? I want to highlight in antitrust, what's critical here is you still have merger control, any new transaction. The DMA just makes you report what you're going to be doing. Antitrust is still the stick if it's going to block mergers. And that specific list of practices, obligations, and duties, as comprehensive as it is, the Europeans recognize they're not able to predict the future. They don't know what the next service is. They don't know what the next technology is. So antitrust is still there to try to go after anti-competitive practices with new, novel market activities that couldn't be anticipated. And then let's look at just what is already in store in antitrust. These are the ongoing overlap cases. So again, it's not surprising the Europeans had very specific ideas of what they wanted to force platforms to do and quit doing, because they've been investigating all of these cases now, or been in litigation in these cases for many years. They know what they were worried about. And then there could also be new cases that come in the future. So this amazing law, with all that it can take on, still leaves one fundamental question. How do you implement it? How do you do all of this as you're also doing antitrust? Go on to the next. So key elements here, as I said, there are some big companies. Start by figuring out who they are. They have some critical services that most businesses in Europe need to rely upon to serve their customers. So the Europeans came up with this idea of focusing on whether you have a significant impact and whether that service is somehow a gateway to a substantial number of users. So then you presume some companies will be gatekeepers based what? On just some basic facts about how big they are, how many customers they have, how much money they make. Pretty straightforward. This is not antitrust. This is not finding detailed analyses of market power, how many firms there are, and running HHI analyses of concentration levels. Pretty simple, straightforward. Again, they want to make sure this works. They want to make sure it's foolproof, right? The companies can challenge it, but a lot of it is numerical. And then there's also some qualitative standards, so that if the numbers don't seem to be yielding the result you want, you can look at other factors that show dominant force in a marketplace. So with all of that, you also want to have a simple enforcement process. So who gets to enforce? European Commission, period, full stop, that's it. One enforcer. However, there are competition authorities throughout Europe, and they have the opportunity to investigate anything and everything, besides under their own law, also under the DMA. But then they have to hand it over to the Commission for full enforcement. So a lot of staff is being hired. Staff is being reassigned across from competition antitrust side to the DMA. But think about the companies we're dealing with, how large they are, how many lawyers and economists they have, how many other experts they have working against this. This is not a huge public operation, but it has an enormous task. So the details of the DMA were designed to try to create incentives for self-compliance. Let's look at what that looks like. There's a designation process. Are you a gatekeeper or not? Do you have core platform services? You can kind of walk through this. I won't go through all the details. The companies have to come forward and say whether they are gatekeepers, what core platform services they have. They have to do it relatively quickly. It gets quickly reviewed by the European Commission. They can challenge it, but it's the honor system up to the point where the law takes full effect. So 6 months for the designation process. Let's go to the next slide, Claire. These reporting obligations, the end of 2023, We should know everybody who's a gatekeeper and what all the core platform services are. Otherwise, at that moment in time, the commission can launch infringement actions against any of the companies for any one mistake in their designation of either their services or whether they are a gatekeeper. So this is designed to create a very strong incentive for the companies to comply. And my observation at this point, we don't know how this will work, is that this is the ball game. If the commission has done this right, a lot of companies, however big and resourced they are, will be scared enough because of the amount of money that's at stake for a fine or a penalty to come forward and honestly describe who they are and what they do and what needs to be subject to regulation. Only gatekeeper services that are core platform services are subject to these stringent rules, nothing else. And then there's audits that will happen over time. So the question here is, what will the companies say? How detailed will these reports be? And I can assure you, there are many, many very smart people across Europe trying to figure out how each company is going to behave, and working for the companies, how they need to behave, what they really need to do. Because remember, there are these big penalties, but there's also an extra penalty, which is that 3 infringements, 3 strikes, and you're out. 3 infringements over 8 years, and the commission is empowered to launch a market study to determine whether you need to be restructured. Restructured, broken up, separate out different assets, can put a ban on new acquisitions while they're doing this. Again, the idea was a comprehensive remedy, right? So will that create the incentive for these reports to be fully compliant and extensive enough to explain to the commission how they're following the law? Now, there are appeals, but think about this. You can fight about whether you're a gatekeeper or not, like how many customers do you have, how much money you have. I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of that. Is your service a core service? Well, those were also fairly numeric. How many businesses rely on you? How many customers do they have? I mean, on the margin, you could see some of that. There could be litigation about that. I mean, generally, there are no defenses that the Europeans have made available the way we think of in most litigation. Court of Justice has unlimited authority. We don't know if there will be lower court cases that are taken before they get to the Court of Justice. That's ambiguous in the way the statute's written, but all power there. And again, these findings, keep in mind what is really unique about them and the prohibitions that grow from them. These are legislative findings. This isn't Tom Wheeler and John Sallett sitting at the Federal Communications Commission saying, we think the public interest includes no tying, no MFNs, no exclusive contracts, because that's how we interpret the public. No, no, no. This is the European Union saying, because of these practices you have engaged in over the years, we believe markets are not contestable. They're not drawing entry, and companies aren't expanding in them, and that you're engaging in contractual behavior and other relationships with your customers that are unfair and don't allow them to earn a reasonable profit. And in our wisdom, in reviewing everything you platforms have done, we have taken into account all your free products, all the efficiency of Amazon Prime and everything else that will be claimed as an efficiency. We factored it all in. And this is where we landed. These specific prohibitions, these behavioral obligations. We're done. Oh, there are a few defenses. So you can claim that there's a fundamental security issue at stake. And those are real: privacy issues, security of your technology. You can claim that your service basically can't exist, can't make any money. So those are defenses for certain of these obligations. And then there's one that I do think is actually probably more meaningful in the long run. We'll see over time. And that's a general principle under European law that is emulated in the DMA, and that is that the remedy has to be proportionate. But nobody knows exactly what that means. So that, I do believe, will be contested quite substantially. But then there's a hammer too. Whatever it was we couldn't think of, or that you might try to game the system with, we have an anti-circumvention provision. You can't split apart services in various ways so that you don't meet those thresholds to be a gatekeeper or a core platform service. And you can't engage in any behavior that is the kind of behavior that we've just said you shouldn't do through contracts, or you shouldn't do through interfaces and designs and how you present your technology. But whatever it is you call it, if it's the same kind of thing, it would be subject to the restrictions of the DMA. So it seems ironclad, right? Is it? How is this going to really work? So this is where I need your help. Each one of you, let's say for a minute now at least, is working for one of these companies. And your job is to figure out, how do I get around this? I mean, it seemed like they thought about everything, right? But Tom, John, you ran an agency, you're general counsel there, you had reached points where you had specific rules. You knew exactly what you were prohibiting, what you were allowing. Was that ironclad? He's laughing. There's always ways around. We just don't know exactly what they are. So let's think about gaming this a little bit. Here's the easy one. If the commission comes in and tries to prohibit certain things that go beyond what the words of the statute are, you're going to have a fight. You're probably going to have legal fights just to try to slow down the process anyway, right? Because you're going to want to litigate what a core platform service is. And as long as you have a colorable argument that your service is not exactly one of those ones that was in that list, even if you just renamed it from Google search, Google advice. I don't run a social network anymore. I run the metaverse. Not the same thing, right? Or is it? There are going to be all kinds of interesting challenges. There's a lot of ambiguity. What is proportionate? What is a remedy that is actually proportionate? I mean, what would you guys do if you're Meta, if you're Google? What do you do? You know, technology changes every minute, right? Algorithms are being adjusted all the time. How many times have you done something with one of those companies where they change the name like the next week, the next month, the next year? Happens, right? It's just normal evolution of products and services. You got to believe there's going to be an awful lot of evolution of what search and app stores really are, and what a social network is or isn't, or how it looks. And then, well, you can't favor yourself in indexing and rating, self-preferencing, but little gap in the DMA. It doesn't say you can't self-preference in other ways. You can't favor yourself in other ways, just ranking and indexing. So what are the ways in which companies favor themselves? If Amazon can show with A/B testing that their free delivery is related to consumer preference and related to the fact that certain businesses benefit from it, and it's when they change the name of what someone else does with their name and whatnot, the testing comes back the same. It is a better market result, better product. They can charge more for it. They can create certain relationships with it, maybe, can they? Forms of self-preferencing. If it's not just straight ranking and indexing. I mean, who knows? When you impose these kinds of restrictions, what kind of new partnerships will companies want to put together? And joint ventures. Maybe some of those companies they were fighting with before would want to work together. I mean, in the end, it's all about making money, right? It's not just about beating Google or Apple. It's about how to run your business. And if you can partner with them, why not? So there'll be a lot of gaming here. I'd love you to think about that. We can talk about that. Here we'll have a little bit of extra time. But regardless of some of those events, there will be enormous energy put into dealing with this law. It's impossible for there not to be, given the precise prohibitions and behavioral requirements and the level of penalties, if Europe has the guts to impose those penalties, which we'll also see. This is going to be a game changer. So here in the US, as Tom mentioned, we've got legislative proposals that are not totally dissimilar from the DMA. Kind of the same target companies, different way of framing it up and describing it. But it's a lot more general in terms of focusing on discrimination that's harmful, self-preferencing in general. But then we kept in this legislative proposal what the Europeans dropped, which was a requirement that you show material harm to competition. Now, why is that so different? Because what I described to you before was it didn't matter if something was free. It didn't matter if something was efficient. The Europeans found it in its aggregate pulling together of factors to be subsumed within its final determination. No defenses, no explanation for why you behave that way. It's just illegal. This would actually require that you show harm to competition and have a number of defenses from the companies as to why something that maybe on its face appears to be not letting another company make a lot of money is actually better for the marketplace and is competition on the merits. So that's an important difference in the legislation. Right now, even this milder version, this version that is much more, say, amenable to platform arguments, as Tom said with the advertisements, is kind of bollocksed up in Congress, hasn't made progress. The United Kingdom has a similar kind of proposal. Also with a new prime minister, there's some uncertainty about how this will play out in the UK, whether the legislation will be put forward, but it's pretty much drafted. Again, it's much more general than the DMA. It has even a broader set of balancing factors than the US legislation does. Allows the companies to make all kinds of arguments to be balanced against all the harms that an agency would find. That creates a new digital regulatory unit in the government to have a digital regulator. But again, we don't know if that'll go forward. But one other important aspect of the UK law is their underlying antitrust law has some tools that are stronger than the US and certainly stronger than Europe. And that is that they can do a market study. And on the basis of that study, regardless of company's intent or whatnot, if they find that it's a harmful competitive structure or non-competitive structure, they can require divestitures and breakups across a sector of an industry. That's a pretty big hammer to have. So having a more general statute maybe lines up better with their antitrust law. So these are out there as uncertainties, but what does all this mean? Will the DMA have this global impact? Or I don't see how it doesn't. If the GDPR had impact, and there was a lot of indication that it did, and it's driven a lot of privacy statutory proposals, and this whole new data treaty was necessary as a result of the GDPR, it's hard for me to believe this won't. Now, can companies segment their services? Can Google search be different in Europe than in the US? Can your app store function differently in Europe than in the US? I mean, certainly certain things can be very different. Something that is a prohibited exclusive contract in Europe could be allowed in the US, and the companies could do both. You'd get some market comparisons. You'd see if consumers are better off, if businesses are better off. But some of these things are really hard. Interoperability. If you're interoperable in Europe, but you've got people on your platform from other parts of the world and you're running a global network, I mean, that's a technological nightmare to think about. And some of the tying and bundling arrangements too, be very difficult when you've got customers and suppliers, people on your platforms, users of the services on the platforms all over the world. Even how to segment that out would be very, very difficult. So I think, you know, this is almost certainly going to be the driving force for how these platform companies evolve their services and for how other countries are able to legislate and regulate or not. So then the final question is, when's all this really going to happen? So I put together a timeline. The bottom is the Digital Services Act, which I have not talked about, parallel law on content regulation in Europe. Let's focus on the top. All of that designation of who is a platform, what is a core platform service, who is a gatekeeper, what is a core platform service, all that is going to happen starting now through 2023. There is no Administrative Procedures Act regulatory framework around any of this. They are obligations and prohibitions. There can be conversation with the European Commission. They don't have to talk to you, but they can. There's some things they do have to talk to you about, things like security and privacy, but that's about it. So unclear how much of this will be public, unclear how much of it you will see, but this will all be happening through 2023. But it's that report on compliance in the end of 2023 that, as I say, I think is the ballgame, because that is public. There'll be redacted and unredacted versions of it, but that is what will be the jumping off point for if the commission thinks the companies are infringing and start actions against them. So I'd say early 2024, if we haven't seen things in public before then, is when you're going to start seeing this trickle out. And I think pretty quickly impact markets. So that's it. Now, surely you have some questions or thoughts, or you figured out better ways to game this than what I presented.
just have each the the US is, and I'm not critical that because worldwide, yeah, with
Better answer than anybody else, but back people haven't been aware of the fact that Europe has really done this. And if they think that Europe now, again, if it's not very effective, if it doesn't have that much impact, if there's 150 people the commission is counting on to implement this, it just can't keep up with things, then maybe it's not as big a deal. It's going to be a shocker in US policy. And unclear what the implications are. But if I were working with those companies, I would be wanting the US to move forward on policy rather than trying to run ads to block everything, because I would want something that's a bit of an alternative. And I'd want anything the US does is not going to be as hard hitting as what I just described to you. I guarantee it. And so you want to have back and forth across nation states to actually have this discussed. And I wouldn't be surprised if this enters front and center in trade policy. I mean, the financial implications here for some companies could be large enough to where anyone running the US government is going to have to take it into account in trade.
Yeah, thank you. To kind of build on that, I mean, what areas of the kind of policy network do you think there are room for US policy to kind of build on this? You seem pretty confident that the DMA is going to have a pretty like global impact. How would, a potential US follow-up regulation play with the DMA? And would that need some kind of like, trade diplomacy angle to it?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, I also said there are a lot of antitrust cases going at the same time. And one of the difficult things I didn't get into was how Europe itself balances things that are cases right now, whether it continues them or it shifts them over to DMA implementation, thinking that can go more quickly or not, and what new cases they bring. So there's a lot of complexity there. But I think that, again, if I put myself in the shoes of the companies, I want to be able to, I know I can do some interoperability. I know I can make a lot of money without having to self-preference everything and having to restrict every contract. I would want to drive policy somewhere that is showing that I can be nicer to other companies and treat consumers fairly and still make a lot of money, especially if I don't think the DMA got the balance exactly right. So I think you're going to see some incentive shift, but it also may be after a first, explosion of anger and trade wars or other things that are just more an emotional reaction. But my sense is Europe isn't backing down unless there's really a change in power structure in Europe. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A great question, Carolina. I mean, one of the things that I think the Europeans were very explicit about in discussing privacy in the context of the DMA was that they weren't sure they got GDPR exactly right, because there were competitive implications of large firms being able to implement GDPR better, more thoroughly, at lower cost to them than smaller firms, and it actually had a harmful effect on competition. So they now understand they need to integrate the thinking on both. And there are a lot of provisions, the interoperability ones, the ones on data transfer, the ones on data portability, the ones on who gets to look at what data with what consent, that are all GDPR compliant. So they've tried to combine the two together. Again, I don't know if it'll work, but there's a clear understanding that those different policy goals need to be united.
I'll find you, Joanna, in just a second, but I have to ask a question here really quickly. So if you think about the US version of the legislation that's being discussed, it has this aspect of saying, materially affects or harms competition. And you said that's not in the DMA. And so it raises in my mind the question of what really is the motivation. If it's not to protect competition, and competition is harmed as is not a defense, what's the objective? And if I give a cynical interpretation, it could simply be, well, I'm Europe and I have no large companies like Google, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, Apple, keep going down the list. And I'm really trying to protect my small businesses and the companies that use the platforms. So this is just power politics at the regional and kind of national level, and trying to minimize the effect of these large companies. I'm intentionally playing a bit of devil's advocate on it.
No, it's a good point.
I don't understand what it's trying to, what the objective of it is.
Remember,
Not
the goal
either
is
protect consumers or
it's not about consumers. It is about promoting contestability and fairness. And let me just read you the description from some of the recitals, which is pretty much the legislative history. The notion of contestability relates to the ability of undertakings, meaning companies, to effectively overcome barriers to entry and expansion and challenge the gatekeeper on the merits of their products and services. Doesn't mean you have to be as big as Google or Meta. Entry, the ability to challenge, effectively overcome barriers to these to their ability to do these things, and to be able to compete on the merits. So the concept of competition is there, but it's not a kind of endpoint. It's a process which almost by definition means these other companies have to exist in the market at some level and possibly even expand to some point and show that they are able to thrive well enough to be profitable. Those are not terms that we use as competition on the merits here for antitrust, for sure. Now, in US legislation, it could be interpreted somewhat differently, but these are more protection of players because of all of these networks effect and economies of scale and scope and some bad practices in the past that they're trying to overcome. What we also don't know with this is 5 years in, how will they define contestability? Because if nobody comes to play, if nobody plays very well, if nobody offers much more, how far is the commission going to try to go with that language to say we need to even do more to prohibit activities by the dominant players? That we don't know. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you for a very, very good presentation. It was fascinating. I have a sort of political question. So it seems to me that that the EU officials and EU politicians build an audience for this type of policy, and they build it in time. They didn't build it overnight, and it ties to what John was saying earlier in terms of what their stakeholders are, who are their voters, do they have to deal with these big companies, to what extent, and so on. My question is, in US, the US politicians build such an audience that they can push something like this through Congress, and they would have voters understand what they're doing and understand that they're doing that for their own good. So does it exist, this audience? Because I feel that this is one of the major distinctions between EU and US on this type of regulation, particularly, and I'm talking about tech regulation, not regulation in general. And I'm looking at your timeline there, and I'm sure that there are other Europeans in the room, and they know that 2024 is European elections. And I'm not surprised at all that that report on compliance, not something else, will come out right before the European elections. So, so about US stakeholders and policy audience, is the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's much harder here for all the reasons you described. And I think also, as much as I said, I thought the companies should come to the table and be, compliant with a US process, I can see their own cynical view of, we'll fight it as long as we can until the Europeans do something crazy. Well, then we'll go to Congress and we'll ask for something that's like half a loaf or a third of a loaf. So they're playing it out as long as they can, maybe. I'm not sure that's the wisest choice, but I can understand that. But no, they're enormously powerful here, as Tom described at the front end, and that's why it's not happening. But I do think that, again, unless Europe backtracks after the elections, or unless this blows up in their face, I mean, again, it's not easy to implement this. As much as I said, everything is just prohibited, and their obligations, and it's clear cut. They could waste a lot of time chasing after too many gatekeepers and not have enough people to do something that's really meaningful. I mean, there are a lot of mistakes that can be made in this. It's not so easy with the number of people they have too, and they've never done it before. So a lot of things could go wrong, but I think that we're on a bit of a drumbeat of inevitability where there will be more regulation of these companies, and Europe has just kind of led with a real, barn burner.
Yeah, I would give a little bit of one interpretation could be if you looked at this through the lens of Stigler, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Stigler and this whole theory of regulatory capture. This is just two powerful groups of regulatory capture, and in the US you have large firms that are based here with their own version of regulatory capture here, and in the EU, since those firms aren't there, you have regulatory capture of those that need the platforms and don't want them being able to manage a monopoly situation potentially. I apologize.
Yeah. Over time, should I? All right, I'll just do this. So, John, there is another way to understand the European decision. So I have no way to plumb the depths of European motivation, but there's another explanation that fits the facts that Jean said. Let's say we have a practice that we think is anti-competitive 50% of the time and pro-competitive 50% of the time. We're pretty sure we want to have a factual inquiry. Let's say we have a practice that we think is anti-competitive 80% of the time. Well, we're introducing delay and possible error when we think there's an 80% chance of harm. Let's say we think there's a practice that we think is harmful 95% of the time. Gosh, at some point, you'd say it's not efficient, actually, to not just find it illegal. In some sense, the particular prohibitions that Jean outlined could be viewed in this way, that the EU has decided that in this kind of behavior, it's at 95%. And therefore, it is better to protect competition in 95% of the cases than have a contested case in 5%. That assumes a lot about the state of knowledge and the ability to do the calculation, but it would fit with the antitrust experience in both the EU and the US to take that kind of approach. Is that fair?
They certainly have presented it that way. So again, they factored everything in and they reached this conclusion, and that's why it is straightforward obligations and prohibitions.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I like about John's comment is that it does look at the world in a very probabilistic way. And what are the natures of the outcomes, and then how do you respond? I mean, in that context. All right. First of all, I want to say thank you to Jean. That was terrific, I thought.
Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to your suggestions about how we're going to game this whole system.
And then the second thing I wanted to mention is there is a study group this Thursday from 12 to 1. It will be in Wexner GO2, which is the downstairs seminar. And it's going to be John, Tom, and Jean. And Jean is going to be leading. It's going to be on digital policy around the world still.
Actually, John will lead that.
Or John's going to, oh, John's leading it. Okay. And we're having Marcela, and I'm not sure I can pronounce her last name, Matuzo, former chief of staff, Brazilian antitrust authority. So it'll be a continuation of some of this discussion. I would encourage all of you to come if you can make it. So anyhow, and thank you all for coming. And if there's any food left that you haven't inhaled at all, you're welcome to take it with you or whatever.